The 17th time, Elder Vthalin asked me to open my mouth so he could look at my teeth. I decided I genuinely liked the man. Not many people have that kind of honest curiosity. I opened my mouth. He leaned forward on his four-jointed limbs, his clicking mandibles going quiet for the first time since I had walked into the chamber, and he studied my teeth the way a collector studies something he has been told does not exist. The rest of the conclave watched from their crescent formation. 16 alien dignitaries, all going very still in the way I had already learned meant they were processing something they did not have a category for yet. I had been on Vetha Prime for 6 days. In those 6 days, I had given 3 formal depositions, eaten 5 meals I could not identify, and one that I could identify but wished I could not, slept in a room that hummed at a frequency my back teeth could feel, and sat through a welcoming ceremony that lasted 9 hours and included 6 ritual silences at intervals clearly designed to test who broke first. I did not break. I am a professional. I am also the only human within 42 light years, which gives you a certain quality of patience that is very hard to explain to people who have never had to be it. Vthalin finished his examination and sat back. He said something to the translation unit sitting on the table between us. The unit hummed for a moment and then said, in flat standard, "Confirmed, calcium-based dental structure, consistent with predatory evolutionary origin." I said, "I prefer the term omnivore." The unit processed this. Several conclave members clicked their mandibles. I had learned that clicking meant they were managing something uncomfortable. The whole room clicked at once. It sounded like a room full of anxious wristwatches. My name, according to the translation unit, rendered in Veth language as something that meant a persistent lower digestive discomfort. I had corrected this 6 times. It kept happening. I had made peace with it somewhere around day 3. You choose your battles in first contact, and a mispronounced name in a room full of beings who control your landing clearance is not the one you pick. The central elder, Sothkelara, whose ceremonial robes moved slightly even when the air in the room was still, leaned forward and said, "Commander Morrow, you claim to represent a civilization called Earth. You claim this civilization has achieved interstellar travel. You claim your intent is diplomatic contact." "I do," I said. "Then explain," Sothkelara said, "why you came alone." I smiled. Nobody in the room had a translation for the smile. I could see them processing it. The clicking intensified. Here is the thing about first contact that the training materials at the diplomatic corps never fully capture. The most important moment is not your arrival. It is not the opening statement or the credentials or the xenobiological clearance forms, of which there were 47, none of them designed with humans in mind. The most important moment is the first time you do something the other party cannot place into any box they prepared for you before you arrived. They had a box for me. I had read their files on the transit in, very thorough files. They described humans as a probable mythological species, evidence quality assessed as low confidence, interstellar capability rated as unlikely, self-terminating probability rated as high. That last part was, to be fair, not entirely wrong. We had come close, closer than most histories care to admit. That was the part of our story nobody liked to linger on too long. I let the smile sit. Then I said, "I came alone to give you the chance to be comfortable with the idea of me before you had to be comfortable with the idea of everything else." The translator worked through this. Sothkelara's 4 eyes moved from the unit to my face and back again. He said, "Everything else, please clarify." I said, "I will, give it a little time." A silence opened. These beings were extraordinary with silence. They used it with precision, the way some people use pause in conversation as a tool to make the other person fill the space. I was not going to fill it. I sat in it and thought about the coffee I had not been able to find anywhere on this planet and the very specific misery that produces after 6 days without it. Then Vthalin, the one with the honest curiosity and the obvious love of direct examination, reached into his robes and produced a tablet. He set it on the table and turned it toward me. I looked at it. I looked at it for a long time. It was a children's illustration, old from the fatting and the print style, a scan of a physical page from what appeared to be a very old book. The image showed a figure on two legs, upright, surrounded by fire and broken machinery, its fists raised. The figure had too many teeth. Its eyes were drawn as solid white. No pupils, no feeling behind them. Below the image in Veth script, the translation unit rendered without being prompted. The fire walkers, those who cannot be stopped, those who come when the dark grows too quiet, those who move through silence and leave more silence behind them. I looked at the illustration. I looked at the fists. This is from a children's book, I said. Vthalin clicked once, soft and brief. A series, 17 volumes. Cautionary stories told to young ones to explain why certain regions of space go silent, why signals stop, why some worlds once full of life simply go quiet. 17 volumes. I sat with that. Your scholars reclassified them as myth, I said. It was not a question. I had read the archives on the transit in. 400 years ago, Cautionary said. They are entertaining stories. Mythology serves a social function even when the literal content is not credible. I looked at the wide-eyed figure one more time. The fire, the raised fists, the complete absence of anything readable in the face. Some artist on some world I had never visited had drawn that from nothing but stories. From things passed mouth to ear across generations of a civilization that had looked at certain parts of the sky and decided something lived out there that you did not want to find you. It was honestly flattering. They got the fists right. I slid the tablet back across the table. I straightened my jacket. I said, I believe we are going to have a very productive relationship. The conclave clicked, all of them, one long, collective, uncomfortable sound. I stood, apparently not protocol. The room froze. I said, I would like to rest now. I am happy to continue tomorrow morning at the scheduled time. Cautionary studied me for a long moment. Then, you are not what we expected, Commander Morrow. No, I said, I imagine not. I walked out. The chamber door sealed behind me with the sound of something that had been holding its breath finally letting it go. My aide Eli, 26 years old and fresh from the diplomatic corps training program and carrying roughly 3 hours' worth of disaster scenarios behind his eyes, fell into step beside me in the corridor. How did it go? He said. They have 17 volumes of cautionary mythology about humans, I said. He processed this for several steps. Is that good? I thought about the illustration, the fists, the fire, the white eyes with nothing at all behind them. I thought about 412 ships sitting in the dark at 42 light years, waiting on a single word from me. Ask me again tomorrow, I said. I had made my decision. I was just not ready to say it out loud yet. That night in the humming room, I sat on what the Veth had provided as a sleeping platform and reviewed the files I had been reading since before I left Earth. Not the official diplomatic briefing files, not the sanitized version the Conclave had shared with the broader galactic community. The other files, the ones that Earth's Long-Range Intelligence Division had been quietly assembling for 11 years, pieced together from signal intercepts and the testimony of whatever survived the expansion of the Dravik hegemony. 11 years, 37 worlds, not conquered, not absorbed, not negotiated with, simply gone quiet, one after another, in a pattern that moved like a tide through the outer systems. I had flagged this to the Conclave on my second day. I had used clear language. I had used data. I had used the specific and particular patience of someone who has been in rooms before where the data was clear, and people still looked at the ceiling and talked about the importance of verifying before acting, of being measured, of not escalating. The conclave had thanked me warmly. They had tabled the discussion for their next formal session. Their next formal session was 4 months from now. I closed the files. I looked at the ceiling of my room, which was a pale, soft color that the Veth apparently found calming. It did not calm me. I was not particularly calm. I was the particular opposite of calm that presents in a trained professional as complete stillness. I thought about 412 ships, about the one word they were waiting on. I lay back on the sleeping platform. The room hummed. I thought about the illustration, the firewalker with the white eyes and the raised fists. Then I thought about 37 worlds that had gone quiet. Some things follow you into the dark. I have learned not to ask them to leave. You just carry them forward and let the weight of them remind you why you are doing what you are doing. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep well that night, but I knew exactly what I was going to do in the morning. The Veth University of Vethaprime offered me a guest residency on my 8th day, which I accepted mostly because they had better coffee than anywhere else I had found in the city. Not real coffee, something adjacent to coffee, made from a roasted seed that grew on the North Continent. It was close enough to count. I spent the next 10 days attending lectures as a guest, which is to say I sat in the back of large halls and was stared at for the entire duration by students who had heard there was an actual human on campus. Most of them had the decency to look away when I caught them. The ones who did not look away were the ones I made a note of. You always want to know the people who are too curious to be polite about it. The university's xenoanthropology department, which had a name in the Veth language that translated roughly as the study of things that probably do not exist but are worth examining anyway, had assembled a collection of research on humanity that was, all things considered, impressive for people who did not believe we existed. 42 academic papers, 7 book-length studies, a doctoral dissertation titled Firewalker Mythology as Psychological Projection in Early Interstellar Cultures, which had apparently won a significant academic prize 30 years ago. I read the dissertation one evening in my room. I sat with it for a long time afterward. It was not wrong about several things. It was also wrong about its conclusion, which was that humans had most likely ceased to be a functioning civilization before achieving anything at meaningful scale. I sent a copy of the abstract back to Earth with the message, "They think we are gone, thought you should know, more to follow." Nina Graves, my communications counterpart at the Diplomatic Corps Central Office, sent back, "This is consistent with the mythology situation you mentioned. How are you holding up out there?" I sent, "The coffee is almost drinkable. Do not concern yourself." She sent, "I never concern myself." We both knew that was not entirely true. We had both been at Kepler. We knew exactly what concern looked like when it mattered. But this was not the kind of exchange where you said that directly. You worked around it. You keep the wound out of the conversation and the conversation moves forward. The university offered me a tour of their Museum of Natural and Historical Phenomena on my 12th day. My guide was a junior faculty member named Selmarath, who was young by Veth standards, had 4 of his 6 eyes tracking me at all times, and was working very hard to appear professionally neutral about the fact that he was walking next to the only confirmed member of a species his entire academic department had classified as an entertaining myth. He was not succeeding at the professional neutrality. I found this genuinely charming. The museum was large. It had 17 wings, which seemed to be the Veth's preferred unit of large-scale organization. We walked through geology, through paleontology in several flavors, through the long history of Veth civilization itself in a wing so enormous that Selmarath told me most school groups only ever completed about half of it before the scheduled pickup. Then we came to the wing at the end of the south corridor. The sign above the entrance rendered in translation as, Extinct and Improbable Threat Civilizations, a study in galactic self-termination. I walked in. The wing was smaller than the others, more enclosed. The lighting was different here, lower and more deliberate, and the display cases were arranged in a circle rather than in rows, each case devoted to a civilization that had risen, become dangerous to others, and then ceased to be. There were 11 cases. I walked the circle slowly. Each case told the same kind of story in a different language, a species that had reached a threshold of capability and then, for various reasons, had not survived the next 100 years. Some had gone to war with each other. Some had gone to war with their own environment. One, according to the display card, had simply stopped reproducing, and their records, which were sparse and damaged, did not explain why. I came to the 12th case. It was smaller than the others, set slightly apart from the main circle, closer to the far wall, as if it had been added after the original arrangement was completed and there had not been quite enough space. The label on the case read in Veth script, Probable Mythological Species, the Fire Walkers, Human Colloquial Designation, Confidence Level, Low, Classification, Extinct or Non-Existent. Inside the case, behind the display glass, there was a reproduction of what the Veth believed a human spacecraft had looked like. Small, primitive by the standard of the other displays, built from whatever the scholars had been able to extrapolate from distant signal data, and 17 volumes of cautionary children's stories. The shape of it was wrong in several details. The general idea was right. It was an early design, the kind of vessel Earth had been building during a particular period of our history, before we refined the architecture, before we understood the transit variables well enough to build around them properly. My father had served on a ship of that class. I stood in front of the display case for a long time. Selmarith came to stand beside me. He said, carefully, "This exhibit was controversial when it was added. Some scholars felt it did not belong alongside confirmed civilizations. The debate was resolved by placing it in the lower confidence classification, a compromise." I said, "How long ago was it added?" "About 200 years," he said. I nodded slowly. "The ship," I said, "the reproduction in the case, do your scholars know what type it is?" Selmarith looked at it. He said, "The documentation simply calls it a Firewalker war vessel." I looked at the model for another moment. Then I said, "The display card says we are extinct." Selmarith was quiet. Then, in a careful voice, "The prevailing scholarly view does support that conclusion. The absence of confirmed contact over several centuries is generally taken as evidence that the species in question either ceased to exist or never existed in the form the mythology suggested." He stopped, because I had turned to look at him, and whatever was on my face at that moment was enough to stop a sentence dead. I said, "I see." I bought a postcard from the museum gift shop on the way out, a printed image of the 12th case, the model ship, the small card with its low-confidence verdict. I sent it to the 12 members of my surface team, with no message attached. They understood. One evening in the second week, I stood on the astronomy department's observation platform with Selmarith while the alien sky went dark, and I asked him, as a casual aside, about the Dravik hegemony. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They are at the edge of our known space, expanding for some years. The Conclave has been monitoring the situation." I said, "And?" He said, "The Conclave believes diplomacy will be possible once the expansion stabilizes." I looked at the stars coming out one by one above us, stars that the Veth had named, most of them named after things that no longer existed. I said, "Has it been stabilizing?" A long pause. "No," he said, "it has not." I nodded. 2 days later, I walked into the formal conclave session that I had been preparing for since before I left Earth. I had reviewed my presentation 40 times on the transit in and another 6 times before dawn that morning. I had used clear language, simple data, and the specific patience of someone who has sat in rooms like this before and watched the data be set aside in favor of the comfort of procedure. I presented the Dravik intelligence files in full, 37 worlds over 11 years, the pattern of silence moving in a direction, the projected timeline to the nearest Vthalin system. The conclave listened. They asked good questions. They were intelligent people, and they were taking the information seriously. Sothkalara thanked me warmly for the presentation. He said the conclave would review the materials. He said the appropriate subcommittee would be convened. The next formal session was in 4 months. I thanked him. I gathered my materials. I walked out of the chamber at the same pace I had walked in. Eli was waiting in the corridor. He had been there for 2 hours. He looked at my face and did not ask how it had gone. He was learning. I walked back to my quarters. I sat at the desk. I opened the communications terminal. I thought about 37 worlds, about the silence moving like a tide, about a timeline that did not have 4 months inside it. I thought about Kepler and 309,000 people, and the sound of someone in the command room saying we should wait for more data before acting. We had waited. I pulled up the message terminal. I typed one word. Come. I sent it. I closed the terminal. I sat in the humming room and waited. 31 days. I knew the math. I had known it since before I packed my bags on Earth. I knew exactly what was coming, what it would look like to a civilization that had had 400 years of comfortable silence, and what it would look like to a hegemony that had spent 11 years understanding that silence meant safety. I sat with all of that. Then I went to sleep. This time I slept well. On the 22nd day of waiting, I gave a lecture on human communication systems to a room of graduate students at the University of Vthalin, which was either the most routine thing I had done since landing on this planet or the strangest, depending entirely on how you chose to look at it. The students had been attentive for the first 40 minutes. By the time I reached the section on signal redundancy architecture, I could tell that roughly half of them were managing the particular kind of academic boredom that looks like careful listening from a distance, but is actually something much closer to being somewhere else entirely. I was explaining the redundancy built into Earth's long-range relay network, how each node contained 4 independent systems, how the redundancy existed because, at a certain point in our history, we had learned that a single point of failure was a liability we could not afford. Someone in the 3rd row had a stylus they were spinning between their fingers. Spinning, stopping, spinning. I was in the middle of a sentence about signal encryption when my wristcom pulsed. I stopped mid-sentence. The room went quiet. I looked at my wrist. The pulse had the pattern of a priority tier message. Priority tier meant Earth was talking directly to me, not through the relay intermediaries, not through the buffer systems. Direct line. That meant one thing. I read the message. I read it again. I read it a 3rd time, not because I had failed to understand it the first 2 times, but because some information has a weight that requires standing still underneath it for a moment before you are ready to carry it forward. Acknowledged, transit complete, fleet operational, all vessels accounted for, awaiting your instruction. We are here. Admiral Owen Farrell, Earth Diplomatic Escort Fleet. The room was still waiting. The stylus had stopped spinning. I looked up from my wrist at 24 alien graduate students in their lecture seats, all of them watching me with an alertness that had not been present 5 seconds ago. I said, we will have to continue this next week. I gathered my materials from the lectern and walked to the door. Behind me, I heard the clicking start up across the room, the quiet collective sound of 24 students processing the fact that something had shifted in the air and they could not name what or why. There was no next week. I knew that. I said it anyway, as a small courtesy to the version of the day that had existed before the message arrived. Eli met me at the door to my quarters. He had been monitoring the message traffic. He knew already, he said. "They are here." "They are here," I said. He exhaled in a way that was difficult to categorize. Relief, and something underneath the relief that was heavier. The weight of a thing becoming real that has been theoretical for 22 days. I said, "How long before the Veth Deep Space Array picks them up?" He said, "Clara estimates 8 to 12 hours, depending on how far out the fleet holds before coming in system." Clara Voss, our communications specialist, had been running calculations on the Veth Array sensitivities since day 3 of the mission. She was the kind of person who believed in being prepared for the things you cannot stop from happening. I said, "Tell the team to be ready by morning. This becomes official the moment Sothkelara calls." Eli nodded. He started to go. I said, "Eli." He stopped. "You are ready for this," I said. He looked at me, 26 years old, learning fast. "I know," he said. He left. I went to the window and looked at the sky. It looked exactly as it had looked every day for 22 days. The wrong-colored sun moving toward the wrong-colored horizon. The kind of alien sky you stop noticing is strange after enough time. 412 ships were somewhere on the other side of that sky, coming in at transit speed, running dark except for identification transponders, broadcasting on every standard frequency. 42 days of travel, the full weight of what Earth had chosen to send when one person sent a single word home. I stood at the window for a while. I thought about the display case, the small model ship behind the glass, extinct or non-existent, a compromise between scholars. I thought about the illustration, the white eyes, the fists. I thought about Selmareth asking me why humans had survived our long period of internal conflict, and me saying, "We are very bad at giving up." I went to bed. 7 hours later, at 2 in the morning by Vetha Prime's local clock, a priority communication from the conclave reached my room through the wall panel. I was already awake. I said, "I know." The panel rendered Sothkelara's voice in flat standard. "Commander Morrow, our deep space array is returning anomalous readings, a large number of massive objects in close formation, moving at extraordinary velocity, inbound from the direction of your home system. Our chief astronomer has checked the array 3 times. The readings remain consistent." I said, "Tell her the array is working correctly." A pause. "Commander, please clarify the nature of these objects." I sat up. I reached for the formal jacket I had laid out on the chair before I went to bed. "Because some things you see coming, and you prepare for them accordingly." I said, "I will be at the conclave chamber in 40 minutes. I was there in 32. Sothkelara was already at the central seat, all 4 eyes on the tactical display that the conclave had apparently managed to reactivate for the first time in what, judging by the way 2 junior staff members were frantically rebooting consoles in the corner, had been a very long time. I walked to where he was standing. He turned to look at me. He said, "The readings." I looked at the tactical display. The mass signatures of 412 ships registered as a cluster of points, orderly, deliberate, unhurried, moving in from the edge of the system. I looked at the display for a moment. Then I looked at Sothkelara. He had shown me the children's illustration on my first day, the fire walker with the white eyes, the cautionary tale, the myth reclassified into comfortable irrelevance 400 years ago. He was looking at me now with the expression of someone in the middle of a very significant reclassification. I said, "Bless your hearts, you kept the myths." The translation unit worked. Then I said, "That is them." The conclave chamber went silent. All 17 members of it, the staff, the 2 junior officers still holding their tools from the console work, Selmarath, who had come in behind me and was standing near the door with all 6 eyes open. All of them went very still. The kind of silence that has a physical quality, the kind you can feel against your skin. I walked to the side of the room where a water service had been set out for long sessions. I poured myself a glass. I sat down in one of the chairs without being invited to sit. I had been waiting 22 days. I had earned the chair. I held the glass in both hands and looked at the tactical display, and watched 412 points of light move through the dark toward the place where I was sitting. The questions came slowly at first. Sothkelara stood very still for what I estimated was 60 seconds. Which in Veth body language terms I had come to understand meant he was doing serious internal work. Then he said, "These ships, they belong to Earth." "Yes," I said. "They followed you here." "They came when I asked," I said. "There is a distinction." He processed this. "How many?" I said 412. 412, he repeated. Not a question. The voice of someone checking a number they heard correctly and would very much prefer to have heard incorrectly. "Yes," I said. Selmarath near the door clicked very quietly. Sothkelara walked to the tactical display and stood in front of it. He looked at the cluster of points moving in steady formation toward his system. He said, "Why?" I said, "Why did I call them, or why 412? He looked at me. I said, "I called them because of the Dravik situation, and because your next formal session is 4 months away, and the Dravik do not operate on a 4-month timeline. There are 412 because that is what Earth sends when one person has been waiting alone for 3 weeks in a place where the mythology about us is filed under low confidence and probably extinct." The room was very quiet. One of the junior staff who had been watching the tactical display without moving spoke up quietly. The translator rendered, "Elder Sothkelara, additional readings at the outer system boundary, a separate cluster, consistent with Dravik transit profiles." Everyone looked at the display. At the outer edge of the system, 17 points appeared. Still, the Dravik fleet, which had apparently been holding position at the outer boundary, watching, calculating. 14 seconds passed. All 17 points moved. Transit signatures. Gone. The outer system boundary was empty. I looked at my water glass. I took a slow drink. I set it back down on the table. I said, "That is also part of the answer to your question." Sothkelara looked at the empty space where 17 Dravik ships had been 30 seconds ago. He looked at the 412 points of Earth fleet, steady and unhurried in their approach. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I see." "Yes," I said, "I believe you do." The fleet came in system at dawn. Not Earth's dawn. Vethaprime's dawn, which was a slow thing, the wrong-colored sun pulling itself over the horizon with a quality of light that I had stopped registering as strange sometime in the second week. I was on the observation level of the conclave building, which had the best unrestricted sightline to the sky, standing with a cup of the almost coffee, and watching the first ships appear as moving points of light against the display screen that Eli had set up on the railing beside me, relaying the deep space array data in real time. 412 points of light, moving in formation, unhurried, coming home to me after 31 days of going it alone. I was not going to be emotional about this. I drank my almost coffee. Eli stood beside me with his own cup. He had been awake since the first alert, the same as me. He looked like someone who had decided to be calm about something very large and was succeeding through commitment to the decision rather than through any natural ease with it. I said, "First time seeing the fleet." He said, first time it was real. I understood that distinction entirely. At 8 in the morning, my RISCOM received a direct transmission from Admiral Owen Farrell. His voice was exactly as I remembered it from every briefing call before departure. Even, measured, the voice of a man who had commanded very large things for a very long time and had stopped being awed by the scale of them. He said, Commander Morrow, we are in system, all vessels operational. How do you want to run this? I said, hold your current position and let them look for a few hours. Then a formal entry at local noon, standard presentation, transponders visible and broadcasting. He said, understood, you all right out there? I said, the coffee situation has been concerning, but otherwise yes. He said, we brought supplies. Admiral Farrell, I said, you are my favorite person in the fleet. He made a sound that in a less composed man would have been a laugh. Then the line closed. I turned back to the display. By mid-morning, I had received 14 requests for meetings. From the conclave, from the university, from 3 separate governmental bodies that had apparently decided this was a moment requiring their direct involvement. From a xenoanthropology researcher who had the courage to send a message at 9 in the morning asking if I was available for an interview. I was available for nothing except the display and the almost coffee. At 11, Sel Mareth found me on the observation level. He stood beside me for a moment looking at the display. Then he said, 412. Yes, I said. He said, when you saw the museum exhibit, the 12th case, the model ship. Yes, I said. You knew then, he said, they were already coming. They were waiting, I said. They came when I asked. He processed this in the particular way I had come to recognize in him, a stillness that ran from the tip of his crest down to the set of his lower limbs. Then he said, you sent one person first, to give us a chance. That is how we do it, I said. A chance for what? I looked at the display, at 412 points of light arranged in careful formation against the dark. A chance to be reasonable, I said, before the part where being reasonable becomes less optional. Sel Mareth was quiet for a long time. Then, and were we reasonable? I thought about the conclave session, the warm thanks, the 4-month timeline, the 37 worlds that had gone quiet. I thought about 17 Dravik ships that had been at the boundary and were now gone. You are getting there, I said. At noon, exactly as arranged, the Earth fleet completed its formal entry into the system. I watched it on the display with Eli on one side of me and Sel Mareth on the other, and Soth Kelara, who had come up to the observation level at 11:30 and had not said a word since, standing very still at the railing. The fleet entered in standard wedge formation. Leading ship, flanked by 2, backed by 4, backed by 8, the geometry of it precise and deliberate. This was not an aggressive approach. This was a presentation, something putting itself where it could be seen completely, so that no one watching had to wonder what it was or what it intended. The leading ship's identification broadcast was clear on every frequency. Earth Diplomatic Escort Fleet, Command Vessel, Admiral Owen Farrell commanding. It was a large ship. It was the smallest ship in the formation. I heard Soth Kelara make a sound beside me, not a click, something lower and quieter, something the translation unit was not picking up, the sound of a being adjusting the entire architecture of their understanding of what the galaxy contains. I had heard something like that before, different species, different form, same meaning. I understood it. I had made a version of it myself, once, long before I was standing on this observation level, before I had learned the full, honest distance of what we were capable of, all the way to the edge of it in both directions. Eli said quietly, beautiful. I looked at him. He was looking at the fleet display, with the expression of someone seeing home from a very long way away. I said yes. At 12:15, Sothkelara turned from the railing and looked at me. He said, "Do humans do this often? Send one person first with a fleet waiting behind them?" I said, "We send one person first to give the other party a chance to be reasonable. Most of the time it works." He said, "And when it does not?" I looked at the fleet on the display. I said, "Then the one person was not alone after all." He was quiet. Then, "Your intent here is defensive. You came because of the Dravik situation." "Yes," I said. "Not because of us," he said. Something complicated lived in the way he said it. Not relief exactly. Something with more weight than relief. "We knew about your civilization before we knew about the Dravik," I said. "We have been reading your signals for 40 years. You were already on the list." "The list," he said. "The list of civilizations Earth would like to know," I said. "The Dravik situation moved the timeline forward, but we were coming." He processed this. He said, "To know us or to measure us." I looked at him directly. "Both, honestly. We measure everything we are trying to know. It is a habit we have not fully grown out of." He made a sound that was, I thought, possibly the Veth version of a small, involuntary laugh. I said, "The Dravik will not come here now. You understand that?" "I understand it," he said. 17 ships, they were calculating." "They are always calculating," I said. "Their calculation changed when the fleet arrived." He looked back at the display. At 412 ships holding steady formation in his system's approach lane. He said, "Were humans always like this?" I stood at the railing. The wrong-colored sun was at its highest point. The fleet was spread across the display like an argument that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. "We had to become something that could survive," I said. I did not say anything else. He did not ask me to. Some things do not need the rest of the sentence. The formal introduction between Admiral Farrell and the full conclave happened via holographic transmission at 4 that afternoon. Farrell appeared at the center of the chamber in full projection. 62 years old, gray at the temples, wearing his dress uniform with the quiet ease of a man who has worn it often enough that it has become his own skin. Behind him, visible through the command deck window, the formation of ships spread out against the dark. The conclave saw the window. They saw what was behind him. There was a collective stillness in the room. Farrell said, "Elder Sothkelara, on behalf of Earth and the diplomatic escort fleet, I extend formal greetings and confirm that our presence here is in full support of Commander Morrow's mission. We are at your disposal." Sothkelara received this. Then he said, "Admiral Farrell, we were not aware until recently that your civilization existed in the form it does." Farrell said, "I understand." Sothkelara said, "You are larger than we believed." Farrell glanced at me briefly. The way people glance at the person who has been managing a situation when they want to confirm they are reading it correctly. I gave him the smallest nod. He looked back at Sothkelara and said, with the even and undemonstrative honesty that made him the right person for this exact moment, "We are aware that this requires significant adjustment. We have tried to allow time for that. We are patient people." I heard Selmarath, standing near the wall, click very softly. Patient was not the word most people reached for when they looked at 412 ships. But it was the right word. It was the true word. We were patient, in the specific way of a species that had waited its whole history to be taken seriously and had finally stopped waiting. When Farrell's projection closed and the chamber came back to itself, Eli fell into step beside me as I walked toward the door. He said, "That went well." I said, "Yes." He walked beside me in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Commander, is it always this way? After something you have been working toward finally happens, it feels strange. I thought I would feel more." I thought about this, the particular quiet of arriving at a destination that required everything you had. finding the destination quieter than the journey. I said, the feeling comes later, when the work slows down enough to let it in. He nodded. I said, go rest, Eli. Tomorrow is paperwork. He made a sound that, for a young man who had just watched 412 ships resolve a crisis in the span of 14 seconds, was an admirably ordinary expression of mild complaint about administrative work. He was going to be fine. The paperwork was extraordinary. I say this as someone who has completed xenobiological clearance forms designed for species that communicate through bioluminescence. I say it as someone who once spent 3 days in a transit station filing documentation for a first contact that had technically occurred in disputed galactic territory, and therefore required forms from 4 separate regulatory bodies. I say it as a person who has a long and honest relationship with bureaucracy. The paperwork following the formal arrival of 412 ships in a system that had not previously known we existed, in the context of an active security threat that the resident conclave was now retroactively acknowledging required urgent attention, was the most extensive documentation exercise of my career. It took 11 days. Eli handled most of it. He was exceptional. He had the particular quality of a person who discovers under pressure that they are very good at managing large volumes of complex administrative work, and who finds, to their own mild surprise, that this brings them something close to genuine satisfaction. I watched him come into himself across those 11 days, getting cleaner, faster, more certain of what he was doing. On day 7, I told him he had done well. He said, "You already said that." I said, "It bears repeating." He said, "You never say things twice unless you mean them very specifically." I said, "No, I do not." He went back to his work. I went back to mine. The security discussions with the conclave ran concurrently with the administrative work. Admiral Farrell conducted them from the command ship via holographic link, with me present in the chamber as the on-ground anchor. They were productive discussions. The Veth were intelligent negotiators once they had accepted that negotiation was genuinely what was happening. The Dravik had not returned to the outer system boundary. Our long-range monitoring showed their fleet had repositioned to a point 40 light-years distant, where they were conducting what Farrell's intelligence team described as a strategic review. I found this almost impossibly funny, in a way I kept entirely internal. A strategic review. 11 years of expansion, 37 quiet worlds, a hegemony that had moved through space with the confidence of something that had never been told no clearly enough to hear it. 40 light-years away, somewhere in the middle of a repositioning maneuver, someone in the Dravik command structure was reviewing their strategy. I genuinely wished them productive thinking. On the morning of day 11, before the primary security framework was initialed, and before the last significant batch of administrative filing was completed, the first shuttle from the fleet came into the Veth Central Spaceport. I stood on the docking platform and watched it land. It was a small craft by the standards of what was holding formation overhead. A diplomatic shuttle, running standard identification transponders, carrying 6 people, a linguist, 2 cultural liaison officers, a technical advisor for the security framework discussions, a medical officer for the xenobiological exchange program the conclave had agreed to, and a junior administrator who would eventually run the day-to-day operation of the new mission center. The ramp came down. Clara Voss came down it first, which I had not arranged but which made sense because Clara had been waiting for this since before we left Earth, and patience was not one of her defining qualities. She walked down the ramp and stood on the platform and looked at Vetha Prime for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Where is the museum?" I said, "You have been here 10 seconds. She said, "I have read everything about the mythology exhibit twice on the transit. Where is the museum?" I said, "I will take you tomorrow." She looked at me, she looked at Vetha Prime, she looked back at me. She said, "Tomorrow morning." I said, "Yes." She went back to helping the others off the ramp. I watched them come down one by one, 6 people who had crossed 42 light years in a fleet shuttle, and were now standing on an alien planet for the first time, all of them doing the very human thing of trying to appear comfortable with this, while not being entirely comfortable with it yet. They would be. It took about 2 weeks, maybe 3. I thought, they are going to do well. That evening, before dinner, I sat with Clara for an hour while she reviewed the cultural documentation I had assembled during my time on Vetha Prime. She was fast. Her questions cut directly to the real issue beneath the surface issue, which was why I had requested her specifically. She said at some point in the middle of reading a file on the Veth social hierarchy, "How did it feel, the moment the fleet arrived, being the person in the room when it happened?" I said, "Which part?" She said, "The moment, when Sothkelara asked what the readings were and you told him." I thought about this honestly. I said, "Strange, in a way I do not have a clean word for yet." She looked up from her file. I said, "You prepare for it. You run every scenario. You know what is coming because you are the one who sent for it. And then it happens and it is exactly what you expected in every technical detail." She said, "And still?" I said, "And still?" We sat with that for a moment. She said, "The mythology exhibit." I said, "Yes." She said, "Were you angry when you saw it?" I thought about the display case, the low confidence label, extinct or non-existent. I said, "No." She said, "No." I said, "They were doing their best with the information they had. They looked at the available evidence and they reached the most reasonable conclusion it supported. The available evidence pointed to something that looked like absence." Clara said, "But we were not absent." I said, "No, we were just quiet for a while." She thought about this. Then she said, "Is that what we are going to be known as, the ones who went quiet and then came back?" I said, "I think there are worse things to be known as." She smiled. We went to dinner. On the 14th day after the fleet arrived, after the primary security framework had been initialed, and the administrative filing was approximately 80% complete, and Eli had finally had a full night of sleep for the first time since the message arrived, I went back to the museum. Alone. It was the middle of a local workday. The museum was attended but not crowded. I walked through the geology wing and the paleontology wing and the long Veth history wing, and I came to the south corridor, and I walked to the end of it. The sign above the entrance still said the same thing it had said on my first visit. I walked in. I walked the circle of display cases. I had done this once before with Selmarath. I knew every case. I walked it again anyway, slowly, because some things are worth the time of doing twice. I came to the 12th case. The small one set apart from the main circle, the model ship behind the glass, the label. Probable mythological species, the fire walkers. Confidence level, low. Classification, extinct or non-existent. I stood in front of it. The display card had not been updated. Of course it had not been updated. These things take time. Academic processes have their own unhurried timelines, and a 400-year-old classification does not get revised in 2 weeks simply because the subject of the classification has parked 412 ships in your approach lane. I looked at the model ship. Still wrong in the details. Still assembled from inference and mythology, and the careful guesswork of scholars working from incomplete data 200 years ago. I stood there for a long time. I thought about the artist who had drawn the illustration in the children's book, the fire walker with the white eyes and the raised fists. I had been coming back to that illustration in quiet moments for weeks. Not the fists, not the fire. The eyes. Solid white. No pupils. No readable expression. The artist had drawn a creature that could not be understood, that offered no legible emotion, that was simply there and impossible and not going away. That was the part that frightened them, I thought, not the aggression, the illegibility. The things you cannot read are always the things you fear the most. I wondered if we had ever been as illegible as the illustration suggested. Probably yes, in the early years, when we were still learning the languages of everyone else, before we had been out in the galaxy long enough for our expressions to start meaning something that other people could translate. And now, I bought a second postcard of the exhibit, the same image as the first one, the model ship, the small case, the low-confidence verdict. I held it in my hands for a moment. I put it in my jacket pocket and walked out. Vthalin found me on the steps outside the museum. I had not arranged to meet anyone. I was simply standing in the afternoon light with my hands in my pockets, not going anywhere with any particular urgency, which was its own unusual state after 2 weeks of urgency at all hours. He was the one who had examined my teeth on the first day, the one with the honest curiosity, the one I had decided in the 17th examination that I genuinely liked. He sat beside me on the steps, a senior conclave elder in ceremonial robes, sitting on museum steps in the open afternoon. I appreciated the complete absence of ceremony in it. We sat for a moment. He said, "You went back to the exhibit." "Yes," I said. He said, "The card has not been updated." "No," I said, "these things take time." He said, "The scholarly committee that oversees this wing has already been convened. The conclave sent a formal note requesting the revision." I said, "Good." He said, "It will take some time." I said, "I know." We sat in the afternoon quietly. Then he said, "I have been thinking about something you said to the faculty at the university, when one of the researchers asked you why humans survived the long period of internal conflict." I said, "We are very bad at giving up." "Yes," he said, "I have been thinking about that answer. It seems insufficient as an explanation for what I watched arrive in this system 14 days ago." I smiled. He said, "Was it an honest answer?" I said, "It was the most honest short answer I had. The full answer is longer and less tidy." He said, "I would like the full answer." I thought about this for a moment, about whether it would translate across the distance between his experience and mine. I said, "We are a species that almost did not make it, more than once. We came very close to the end of ourselves and we pulled back each time barely, at great cost. And somewhere in those near misses, we learned something that does not have a clean name in any language I have encountered." He waited. I said, "We learned that the worst thing that can happen to you is survivable, not comfortable, not without damage, but survivable. And once you know that, once you have stood in the middle of something you thought would finish you and you are still standing, it changes what you are willing to take on. You stop calculating whether you can afford to try and start calculating whether you can afford not to." Vthalin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That sounds as though it costs a great deal." "Yes," I said, "it does." He said, "The Kepler siege." I went very still. He said, "I read some of the historical materials transmitted with your diplomatic credentials. The Kepler siege is mentioned." I said, "It is." He said, "You were there." I said, "Yes." He did not ask me anything else about it. I had not expected him to. He said, "Were humans always like this, or did Kepler make you this?" I looked at the street in front of the museum, at the city going about its afternoon around us, at the sky above it, the wrong color, the wrong shade of everything, the kind of sky I had been looking at for over a month now and that I had stopped registering as wrong. "Both," I said. "Neither. We were on our way to this long before Kepler. Kepler just made it personal for me." He said, "What does that mean, personal?" I said, It means I am not here because of policy. I am here because of 309,000 people I could not help, and the decision I made afterward that the next time I was in a room where the data was clear and the timeline was real, I was not going to wait for a committee. He was quiet. I took the postcard out of my jacket pocket. I looked at it. The model ship, the low confidence label, the careful scholarly hedge of extinct or non-existent, which was so reasonable, so measured, so exactly the conclusion you reach when you have had 400 years of peace and no particular reason to examine the uncomfortable data too closely. I said, your children's stories were not wrong. He said, no. I said, the scholars who reclassified them were wrong. He said, yes, they were. I said, the frightened children who first told the stories were paying attention. He made the soft, single click that I had come to understand meant something between acknowledgement and something that did not have another word. I said, we scare easy. A pause. We just do not stay scared. He sat with that. The afternoon light moved across the steps between us. Then he said, will you stay on Vetha Prime? I said, for a while, until the framework is established and the permanent team can carry it forward without me. He said, and then? I said, then they send me somewhere else. There is a list. He said, of civilizations Earth would like to know. Yes, I said. He made the sound that I was now completely certain was the Veth version of a small, involuntary laugh. Warm, unexpected, nothing like the clicking of the first day in the conclave chamber, when everything in the room was nervous, and I was a probable myth in a chair being inspected. A long time ago. I stood from the steps. He stood with me. I said the mythology series, the 17 volumes. He said, yes. I said I would like a copy for the journey. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, I will have a set sent to your quarters before tomorrow morning. I said, thank you. He said, thank you. Commander Morrow. I walked back into the city. The fleet was still up there. I could not see it in the afternoon brightness, the ships too far out and the sun too bright for the instruments on my wrist. But I knew it was there. You know when something that large is close to you, you feel the weight of it even when you cannot see it, like standing in a room full of people in complete darkness, the heat of it, the gravity. At dinner that evening, Eli asked me how I was doing, not as an aide asking a commander, as a person asking a person. He had gotten comfortable enough with the distinction over 5 weeks, and I was glad for it. I said, I am fine. He said, fine as in actually fine or fine as in professionally fine. I said, fine the way you are fine when something large has happened and you have not had enough quiet yet to know exactly how you feel about it. Not the bad kind of fine, the kind that is on its way to something better. He thought about this. He said, is that what it always feels like after a first contact? I said, I will tell you after a few more. He said, how many have you done? I said, this was the 4th. He said, and the other 3. I thought about the other 3. 2 of them had resolved well by any reasonable measure. 1 had not. The one that had not was not on the list of things I spoke about easily, and Eli was 26 and had just come through something large, and this was not the evening for the weight of the one that went wrong. I said, different stories for different nights. He accepted this. He was learning when to accept things and when to push. This was not a night to push. We ate in comfortable silence for a while. The city outside was quiet. The sky was deepening to its alien version of night. In a few weeks I would be gone from here. The permanent diplomatic team would take over. The story of this system and Earth would continue without me being the only human in it. That was what it was supposed to look like. You come and you do the hard part, and then you make yourself replaceable as fast as you responsibly can, and you move to the next entry on the list. 46 entries. I was working through them. After dinner, I went to my room. I sat at the desk. I wrote the full debrief for Earth Command. Professional, precise. The kind of document that does the administrative work of a mission and conveys nothing of the texture of it, which is its own difficult skill. At the end of the formal debrief, I added a personal note that would root only to Nina Graves and to the director of the Diplomatic Corps. I wrote, "They had us in the mythology section of their Natural History Museum. Probable myths wing, low confidence, extinct or non-existent. The scholarly consensus of 400 years of very sensible, very peaceful, very thorough people." I wrote, "The children's stories were more accurate than the scholarship. I keep thinking about this." I stopped. I deleted the second sentence. It was true, but it was not my job to put it in a report. It belonged to a longer conversation in a room with people who had the time and the authority to do something with it. I sent the debrief. I sat at the desk for a while. I took the postcard out of my jacket pocket, the museum exhibit, the model ship, the card that said extinct or non-existent. I turned it over. On the blank back of the postcard, I wrote 4 words. I looked at what I had written. I put the postcard in the small travel case that held the things I carried from Earth and would carry to the next system, and the one after that. I went to the window. The wrong color stars were out over Vetha Prime. Different stars, different sky. The fleet was somewhere in the dark above it, 412 points of light in mass and intention that had crossed 42 light years on a single word from me. The city below was quiet. I was quiet. I thought, we are at the beginning of something. I thought it cost what it cost to get here. I thought it was worth it. Outside, the alien night did what nights do everywhere, in every system, around every star that has something alive beneath it. It held. It kept holding. And somewhere in the dark above it, the fleet that had followed me home waited, as it had always been waiting, for whatever came next.